Hello, everyone. Peace be with you and the mercy and blessings of God. Or if I'm to say that in the Arabic language, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I begin by praising our Creator and Fashioner, and I thank Him for bringing us together tonight in such an amiable atmosphere in which we can reflect together on the very important topic of peace and violence in our current world, and the roots or possible roots of peace and violence in our sacred scriptures. I want to thank the IPCI for bringing me here into South Africa. It is my first trip to this beautiful country. I love it already. There's so much to see and do here. There's so much to explore, and so much of an opportunity to get close to nature and to even ride one of your big five. I rode an elephant the other day. I would also like to thank John Gilchrist for agreeing to share a platform with me. This is the third of our 3 debates during this lecture tour, and I am really honored to be on the same platform with a man of such great learning and the author of so many books, especially books on my own religion. I would also like to thank my brother Yusuf Ismail for such a generous introduction, and I thank you all for coming out here tonight. The topic before us is a very important one, and reflecting on what John has said, I am in fact quite surprised at the nature of his presentation. He did indicate to me by email prior to my coming here that he expects that he and I will be much together on the same page with regards to the present topic. I just didn't realize that it'll be so much on the same page. And John has actually said much of what I might have said if he hadn't said it already. He has given a fair assessment, I believe, of the kinds of violence that people might perpetrate on behalf of religion, claiming that they are acting on behalf of God, whereas in fact they are not. And he has rightly put before us that this has been done both by Muslims and by Christians, and they continue to be done by both. Of course, he has been more self-critical than critical of Muslims, and for that I must commend him. That shows a great deal of honesty and straightforwardness, and this of course is the manner in which we can proceed to understand each other if we can each in our own way be self-critical. As for the Quran's teaching, since that is really the thrust of our topic, what does the Quran and the Bible really have to say about peace and violence? Or as the topic puts it, the Biblical and Quranic approach to peace and violence. What shall we say about the Quran? In modern times, the Quran has been much misunderstood, I believe. It is often cited by those who are perpetrating violence in the name of Islam, and they cite verses proving that they are fulfilling the Quranic commandment of jihad. So they misunderstand, I believe, certain key passages of the Quran, which I will now hasten to try and explain. At the same time, non-Muslims looking at the activities of some Muslims and looking at the verses that are cited in this regard might be expected to also misunderstand what the Quran is saying. Moreover, there are some who see an opportunity here. Some see an opportunity to prove to the world that Islam is wrong. They were trying to prove it by some other means, but now they feel that the political climate is ripe for them to now paint before the world a picture of Islam as being a very violent religion at its core. Well, let's look at the Quranic verses then and see what really the Quran teaches about peace and violence. To understand the Quran, one has to realize that the Quran was not a book written by some individual sitting at a desk churning out an entire copy and then giving it to the printing press. The Quran is a revelation, Muslims believe, given to the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, a piece at a time over a period of 23 years. Things would happen around him, and parts of the Quran would be revealed, commenting upon what's happening, giving the Prophet and the early Muslims instructions on what to do. So there are instructions about love and there are instructions about war, but that's because that was the situation at the time. So what were the circumstances that gave rise to the mention in the Quran of verses regarding war? The Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, was born in the year 570, according to most historians. He began receiving his revelation in the year 610, when he was about 40 years old. He remained in Mecca, his hometown, for about 13 years following his initial call, and he began preaching his message in Mecca. His message was not received well by his fellow tribespeople. They felt that his message was a threat to their tribal religion. They did not like the idea of having one God in contradistinction to the 360 gods that they already had. They did not believe that people could rise from the dead after they had become dust. These were difficult beliefs. Moreover, the Islamic call was an egalitarian call. It called for the proper treatment of those who were sidelined, those who were the less fortunate in society, especially the slaves, and we can add the orphans and widows and people of low esteem generally in that society. So the elite did not like the message of Islam, and so they began to persecute the Prophet and his initial followers, especially those followers who were weak and who were themselves slaves and marginalized in society. The Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, began to receive revelation regarding this situation, and the revelations that are in the Quran to this day, speaking of this, instruct the Prophet Muhammad and his followers to turn away from these people who are perpetrating violence on them, to just say a word of peace and turn away from those who are ignorant, and so on. There was nothing in this period regarding taking up arms or even fighting against those who were attacking the Muslims. And one might understand why this was so. Obviously, it would have made no sense for the Muslims to fight at this stage, because to fight would invite their own destruction. The Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, bore these tortures and persecutions for many years, a little bit more than a decade, until eventually during this period, he began to direct his followers to migrate elsewhere so that they could safely practice their religion in peace. Some of his followers migrated to Abyssinia, where they lived under the auspices of a Christian king. Some more went in a second wave to Abyssinia. The Prophet Muhammad himself came to a situation in his life where it was expedient for him to migrate. He migrated to Medina when his non-Muslim opponents made a plot against his life. The story that is found in some of the biographical works say that the Prophet Muhammad escaped during the night while he had left his cousin Ali to sleep in his bed, so that the spies would think that he is still in town, while in fact he had made his way to safety. They pursued him during this hijrah or migration, but the Prophet nevertheless escaped unscathed on that occasion, and he arrived in Medina where he could safely live and practice his faith. But not for long. The historians tell us that the non-Muslim armies came to attack the Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslims in Medina. Wave after wave. So the Prophet Muhammad usually would come out to meet them at certain junctures. So there was the Battle of Badr. The Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, had migrated in the year 622, and the following year, 623, is when the Battle of Badr was fought. If one looks at a map, one will see Mecca down below, that's the hometown of the Prophet Muhammad. One would see Medina above, where the Prophet had migrated to, and close to Medina, the position of Badr, where that first major battle is fought. So you can get the sense that an army marched all the way from down here, going some 400 kilometers to the north to attack the Prophet's city, and the Prophet just simply comes out to meet them at a convenient point, rather than allow them to enter the city and ravish the city. That would, in Muslim counting now, be the first year of the Hijrah. So instead of saying 623, let me say the first year after the Hijrah, or the second year of the Hijrah. Now, the third year, that is a year after the Battle of Badr, the non-Muslim army came to attack the Muslims again. And this time the Prophet went out to meet them at Uhud, which on a small map would be indistinguishable. It would be the same dot as the dot for Medina, the Prophet's city. To this day, when Muslims go to perform the pilgrimage in Mecca, they would go to the site of the Battle of Uhud to to pray to God to bless the martyrs, those Muslims who had died in that particular battle as they were defending the city from being invaded. The uncle of the Prophet, Hamza, died on this important occasion. Some 70 Muslims died in this defensive battle. In the fifth year, the non-Muslims formed such a huge allied force that it was apparent that the Muslims would be decimated once and for all. The Prophet practiced a defensive measure by building, or rather digging, a ditch on the northern pass towards Medina, because that was the expected pass through which the non-Muslim army would invade. Having dug that ditch or trench, the Prophet and his people were able to stay safely behind it, because when the non-Muslim armies came, the Allied forces reached the ditch and they could not cross. The horses would resist any further move. They camped there for a couple of weeks until eventually the elements were too much for them. The wind and the sun and the blowing sand, they eventually dispersed. So that was the fifth year of the Hijrah. In the sixth year, the Prophet Muhammad took his followers on a pilgrimage to Mecca. They were in pilgrim's garb, and they were obviously with peaceful intent. They wanted to re-enter the city from which the Prophet Muhammad had been driven out, and just simply to perform the pilgrimage to the sacred house, the house which Muslims believe was initially set up by the Prophet Abraham and his son Ishmael for the worship of the one God. It was the custom of the time that people from all over Arabia would come to perform their worship services at that temple. Why would the Prophet not be allowed? He should be allowed. But the non-Muslims who controlled that city refused entry to the Prophet and his people. Some of his people wanted to fight back, wanted to fight their way into the city, because they felt it is their God-given right, as it is the right of anyone, to enter the city peacefully and worship. Why should they be prevented? After all, they have the truth, so why should they just accept the sanction of these non-Muslims who do not believe in God and who worship idols, something that both the Bible and the Quran condemned? But the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, cautioned them to remain patient. And he himself signed a treaty with the non-Muslims that indicated several stipulations which were unfavorable to Muslims. For example, one of the stipulations was that if any of the Quraysh people, the non-Muslims, were to embrace Islam and hence go to join the Muslim community in Medina, if his family were to demand him, he would have to be returned to the non-Muslim side. Whereas, in fact, if any of the Muslims were to go and join the Quraysh people, he would not be returned. One-sided stipulations like this were very difficult for the Muslims to swallow. But what was in favor of the Muslim situation was that this treaty would entail 10 years of peace to follow. Eventually, that treaty would be broken, as Muslims understood, from the non-Muslim side. But in the months that followed, in the 17 months in which this treaty remained in place, Muslims could see the effects and the benefits of such a treaty. In fact, the Quran referred to this treaty as a fath, as a victory. Surah 48 in the Quran, and this is the point, this is the reason I am mentioning this whole history, so you can see what the verses of the Quran are dealing with. Surah 48 of the Quran is entitled Surah Al-Fath, the chapter of the victory. It begins by saying, Inna fatahna laka fatham mubina. We have given you a clear victory. Commentators on the Quran generally say that the victory that is being spoken about in this passage is the treaty itself. Now, that is a rather strange way of referring to a treaty. Usually, an army goes and conquers another army and comes out victorious. That is referred to as victory. But where's the victory in signing a peace treaty? Today we know the benefits of a win-win situation. Both sides come out winners. In the case of this treaty, the Quran referred to the treaty as a victory. And the Muslims eventually came to see what was a victory in this, because they said that in the 17 months following the treaty, more people had embraced the religion of Islam than in the 17 years prior to the treaty, during the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Now, what difference does peace make? Peace makes a lot of difference from the point of view of one who wants to convey a message to others. If you're an ambassador for any cause or any idea, you need to reach people when they are at peace with you. If people are at war with you, they do not listen to what you have to say. In fact, they come to you with closed minds. The fight or flight mechanism kicks in. Either they fight you or they flee from you. But in peacetime, they will listen to you. They will interact. And this, of course, was the benefit of having this peace treaty. We can see then that during this period of time, over the 6 years that I've just described before you, and the major battles that have taken place here, you can understand now the verses of the Quran that speak to these various circumstances and occasions. The Surah 33 in the Quran is referred to as Surah Al-Ahzab, the chapter about the allies. And that is because it reflects on the fact that these allied forces had come to attack the Muslims in this battle, which comes to be known as the Battle of the Allies, and alternatively is also called the Battle of the Trench, Khandaq, because the Muslims had dug that trench, that ditch I spoke about, to stave off the enemy from entering their city. What were the Muslims to do after they had migrated away from Mecca, the few Muslims who did along with the Prophet, peace be upon him, and went up to take safe haven in Medina? Remember, the Prophet was born in Mecca, he was driven out, and he now lives safely and at peace in Medina. What was he to do and his followers to do when they are now being attacked? This was a new question. And the Quran seems to speak about this in Surah 22, verses number 39 to 40. أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتَلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا. Permission is given to the Muslims to fight back because they have been oppressed. الَّذِينَ أُخْرِجُوا مِنْ دِيَارِهِمْ بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ إِلَّا أَنْ يَقُولُوا رَبُّنَا اللَّهُ. Those who have been driven out of their homes without justice, simply because they said, our Lord is God. ولولا دفع الله الناس بعضهم ببعض لهدمت صوامع وبيع وصلوات ومساجد يذكر فيها اسم الله كثيرا. If it had not been for the fact that God used some people to drive back some others, the churches, the synagogues, the monasteries, and the mosques in which the name of Allah is being recited much would have been destroyed. Here the Quran is speaking about a real situation in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, where there was no religious freedom as we have it now, in which a situation there in which the non-Muslims were interested in decimating the Muslim population, demolishing whatever mosques there were, and in fact such an attitude does not restrict itself to demolishing mosques. Such an attitude would prompt people to demolish churches and synagogues and monasteries as well. And it is interesting that the verse of the Quran that speaks about this says that God uses some people to drive back some others, to defend against the attacks of some others, because if that were not the case, the others would demolish the churches and synagogues and monasteries and mosques. This verse seems to indicate that Muslims need to defend not only their mosques, but also the churches and synagogues and monasteries. This in the Quran is one of the justifications of war, to defend the sanctuaries and the places of worship, not only of the Muslim faith, but of all faiths. So the verse began by speaking of permission being granted to the Muslims. This is not a command to go and fight. This is a permission for the Muslims to defend themselves against their attackers. Rules now come to be drawn up for war, and they are mentioned in the Quran. For example, in Surah 2, verse 190 and forward from that. وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا. And fight in the way of God against those who fight you, but do not transgress or do not be aggressive. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Certainly God does not like those who are aggressive or those who transgress. So there is a stipulation here that the Muslims are to fight those who are fighting against them, but they are not to be aggressive or transgressing in such a situation as well. So we see then that the Quran ultimately has a peaceful outlook. Peace is really the basis of what the Quran is establishing. That was preached during the Meccan period for about 13 years until the Prophet migrated. And now the new situation of the Muslims is that they do have some ability, they do have some power, they can finally rise in their defense. And now their personal obligation and the obligation to their fellow citizens is in fact to rise in defense. But that cannot change the modus operandi, the basic principle of the Islamic faith, that it is about peace, and you turn away from the ignorant, you move away from the scene of violence, you work towards peace, you live for peace. But now what are you to do when you are being attacked? Permission is given for you to defend yourselves. Muslim commentators on the Quran, unfortunately, have often thought of the Quranic verses as canceling each other. They subscribe to a doctrine known as naskh, in which they said that certain verses of the Quran cancel some other verses. So that whereas we're reading the Quran and we're finding the verses that speak about peace and being at calm with the enemy and turning away from violence and saying a word of peace and turning away from the ignorant and so on, they would say that the verses which speak about engaging in war cancel all of the previous verses, all of those verses from the Meccan period. Other scholars think that the doctrine of naskh has been much exaggerated beyond reasonable proportion. Several scholars from the classical and medieval period have tried to mitigate the number of verses which have been cited as abrogating and abrogated verses, especially the abrogated verses. So that some scholars had said that as many as 400 verses had been abrogated in this way, which means that there will be some 400 verses in the Quran. As you're reading them, you have to have in mind, these don't apply, these don't apply, these don't apply. But Imam as-Suyuti, rahimahullah, from the 15th century, in his book Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Qur'an, had narrowed down the list to only 21 verses. And Shah Waliullah of Delhi, the late 17th century scholar of international fame, has in his book Al-Fawz al-Kabir fi Tafsir, has narrowed down the list to only 4 verses. John Burton from the University of Edinburgh has studied the arguments in detail, and he thinks that none of these verses actually can be held up as being abrogating verses or abrogated verses according to the way in which the classical doctrine was put forward. Yasir Qadi, in his book Introduction to the Sciences of the Quran, suggests that what we should speak about instead is not naskh or abrogation, but takhsis or specification, which means that a certain verse speaks about a certain situation and it is specific to that situation. It may apply again to any other situation that is similar enough to the initial situation, but then there will be other verses that speak to other situations. So each verse is specific to its type of situation. So no verse cancels each other. The situation changes, so one verse applies to one situation, and the situation changes, and there's another verse that applies to the new and changed situation. So now in reading the Quran, we can have in our minds that all of the verses apply,